Okay, hello everyone. Welcome back to the HBEST Virtual Roundtable Series. I'm Paul Deutschman. I'm a graduate student at Boston College and one of the organizers of the series, along with Courtney Crosby at the University of Texas, Austin, and Christopher Smith at the University of Pennsylvania. So before we start, we'd again like to thank the Executive Council of HBEST for their support in making this series possible. Because this is an HBEST-sponsored meeting, please note that this meeting is subject to the HBEST Code of Conduct, which has been shared in the chat. Anyone who violates the Code of Conduct may be removed from the session. We'd like to encourage audience participation throughout the event. So if you have a question, please use the Ask a Question button on the bottom right of the screen. And please just try to keep your questions to a sentence or two. Also, please feel free to upvote questions asked by other audience members that you would like to see answered. That'll bump that question up to the top of the list. Okay, and finally, everything is being recorded today and will be posted publicly to YouTube after the event. Without further ado, today's discussion will be on the evolution of punishment. And moderating our event today is Dr. Pat Barclay. Pat is an associate professor of psychology at the University of Guelph, where he researches the evolution of cooperation and the psychological mechanisms that underlie cooperative action. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Pat. I see that we have some issues with echo, so if we could just try to mute ourselves when we're not talking, that should resolve the issue. All right, Pat.
Okay, thanks very much. And thanks to the organizers for setting this up. It's great to see some great folks on the panel here. What I'm going to do is just invite them, everybody kind of, I guess, in the order that people are appearing on my screen, just to say a few words about yourself and why you think that this is an interesting and important topic. So first I'll invite Nichola Raihani, who is at the University College London, fellow of the Royal Society of Biology, and who just had a book come out on the social nature. So maybe I'll invite Nichola first to say some words.
Thanks, Pat. Yeah, so yeah, I've been interested in punishment for, I guess the first paper I started working on this was in 2010, so 11 years ago, with Redwan Bashari, and not in humans, but in cleaner fish, actually, which I guess we'll talk about at some point later. But I've always been very interested in punishment, as it's thought to be obviously one of the key mechanisms for supporting cooperation in interactions where individuals might be tempted to exploit one another. And so, yeah, the more I've studied it, the more confused I've got about it. And I guess we'll also talk about that as well.
Okay, thanks. Let's bring in Jillian Jordan, who is, I guess now you're in the business school at Harvard. So congratulations on that. And yeah, we'll invite Jill to say some words about herself.
Thanks so much. Yeah, so I have also been interested in punishment for a while. Actually, my first work on punishment was with Katie when I was an undergrad. So that is fun. And I think that I'm particularly interested in punishment these days, just in light of sort of how much moralistic punishment and outrage has sort of dominated contemporary discourse, especially on social media. And it feels like it's sort of increasingly playing an important role in cultural debates and sort of is on people's mind more. And I'll also just say that generally my research sort of focuses on moral psychology with a focus on the role of reputation and signaling, which lots of other people on this call are also interested in. And so that's sort of what has interested me the most about punishment, especially these days.
That's actually a good segue to bring up Katie next, to say some words about herself and why she thinks punishment is interesting and important. Oh, have we lost Katie? Can anybody else hear Katie? Okay, maybe I can get the organizers to sort out the technical aspects of that. However, to do that, and maybe in the interest of keeping things going, I will pass that on to Max instead.
Hi, everyone. Max Krasnow here, psychologist by training. I've been interested in punishment probably, I would say I've been working on it for maybe about 15 to, no, more like 20 years. Yeah, what I'm interested most in regarding punishment is the design of how it seems to be working with our psychology and what exactly it's doing interpersonally, what it's communicating. I think a lot of the discussion today, it'll be interesting to get into how each of us might be seeing what that communicative function might be from a slightly different lens, and it'll be interesting to see where the conversation goes.
Cool. So let's maybe start out with a question about how common is punishment in nature? What is it used for in other species? Because as a good evolutionary crowd, we need that comparative evidence there. So maybe I'll fire that one to Nichola, if you want to say something about punishment in non-humans.
Sure, yeah, I can do. So I guess the classic view of punishment, and one that for a long time informed my thinking and the way that I approached studies of punishment in humans, was based on this seminal paper by Tim Clutton-Brock, who was my PhD supervisor, and Jeff Parker in '95. And essentially they define punishment as a scenario where one individual cheats, the partner then pays a short-term cost to impose a reciprocal cost on the cheating partner, and then they get their payback on their investment if the target of punishment behaves more cooperatively in future. And so at the time that they published that paper, they there was a kind of prevailing view that punishment was actually pretty common in nature. But it turns out that when you actually start to really pick apart the examples and figure out, are all these three criteria really being met in any non-human species, the evidence is actually really not that, there's not really very much convincing evidence for punishment in any non-human species, actually, it turns out, upon closer inspection. Apart from, not to just big up the cleaner fish, but there is one species where we do have very good evidence for punishment operating in that way, and that happens to be in a species that I've studied with Redron bashari, which is the cleaner fish, which for anyone who isn't familiar with the system, is a small fish, a wrasse, that lives on coral reefs. If you've ever been diving anywhere in the Indo-Pacific, you might have seen one. And if you do ever go diving in the Indo-Pacific before the coral reefs are all destroyed, it's a really great way to see all the species that live there, because most of the species that live on the reef will visit a cleaning station and will visit the cleaner fish to have ectoparasites removed. And it turns out that in this system, there are a few ways that punishment promotes cooperation. So for the cleaner fish, they remove these nasty things on the surface of their client's skin. They remove ectoparasites and dead skin and things like that. But what they prefer to eat is mucus and scales. So they prefer to eat the living tissue. And this is painful to the client and also damaging. So the clients have some tricks up their sleeve to force these cleaner fish to toe the line and to provide a good service instead of eating all their mucus and scales. And one of the things that clients will do is that they will aggressively punish a cleaner fish that cheats. And there's experimental evidence now that we have, actually, this is not my work, this is Redron's work, that shows that cleaner fish that are punished are more likely to cooperate when in the next interaction with that client. So that's one way that we see punishment in the cleaners. And then there's a sort of more unusual scenario where we see it, which is that occasionally a male and female will work together to inspect one client together. So the male cleaner fish and the female cleaner fish work together to service one client. And in some ways, the situation they're in is a bit like an underwater prisoner's dilemma, because only one of them, if one of them cheats and bites the client, there's about a 50% probability, 50% chance that the client will leave. So essentially one of them gets this tasty, delicious mucus, and then dinner departs for both of them. So there's a personal benefit and a shared cost. And it turns out that the way that service quality is maintained in that scenario between a male and female who are interacting with a joint client is that males actually punish their female partners if the female cheats and causes the client to leave. And we've demonstrated experimentally that receiving punishment from the male, that it's basically aggressive chasing and trying to bite chunks out of the tail. When the female is punished by the male, she is then more cooperative. She's less likely to cheat in the next interaction she has with that male partner. And so there are now other examples, but I think that's probably a kind of nice, simple one to start with. And if people want to hear more about non-humans, we can, of course, return to it.
Sorry, Pat, you're still muted. But if you wouldn't mind, I would like to just jump in real quick. Thanks, cool. I think some of the discussion might turn on the semantic question of exactly what we're including when we're talking about punishment. In the way that I like to think about it, I would say that punishment is a more broad phenomenon than simply one that we can understand within kind of the classic prisoner's dilemma style cooperation, where it's a social dilemma at stake. Looking at kind of the behavioral features of those cleaner fish, right? What you're doing as a cleaner fish in one of those mated pairs is aggressing towards the partner, and aggressing to get your way, aggressing to enforce a standard of treatment, aggressing to win resources. Once we kind of back the definition down to that level, I think we could say that that's much more common in the animal kingdom. And we might actually find that a lot of what we want to think of as cooperation enforcing punishment in humans might be at least tinged by that kind of standards of treatment enforced aggression enforced standards of treatment.
So this is maybe a good segue into a question about punishment is often being framed as though it's like a self-sacrifice, at least within the human cooperation literature. Whereas, some of the examples that you've just talked about, this doesn't sound self-sacrificing at all. Katie, good to have you back. Does anybody maybe want to comment on this about whether punishment is indeed self-sacrificial? Is it altruistic punishment? Winners don't punish. Do you agree that this punishment is self-sacrificial, or are there these benefits for it?
Pick me. Just to respond to Max, I think the main thing, I think it is worth being really clear about whether you're talking about immediate short-term costs and benefits, or whether you're talking about fitness costs and benefits. And in the case of the cleaner fish, at least, there is an immediate cost that is paid by an individual that decides to aggressively chase its partner, be that the client or the male cleaner fish. And the return benefit is contingent on the partner changing its behavior in some way. And that is basically the key definition of, that's negative reciprocity. It's the exact opposite of positive reciprocity. And that's why I guess Tim and Jeff defined it like that. There has to be this immediate investment, and the benefit is somehow contingent on the partner changing their behavior. So I actually personally I now think there are quite a few examples where we can think that the way you get your benefit back might not be contingent on the partner changing their behavior, actually. And there are other ways you could, in principle, benefit as a punisher. But I think keeping that distinction between, are we talking about short-term costs and benefits or fitness costs and benefits, is helpful to make sure we're kind of talking about the same thing.
I totally agree. One thing I would just quickly add is I also think the distinction between whether you're punishing on behalf of yourself as a second party or punishing on behalf of someone else as a third party feels pretty relevant to how self-interested it seems. Just in the sense of if I'm aggressing against somebody else because they're not giving me resources or doing something I want, yes, it's energetically expensive and risky maybe to aggress against them, but also like it just never really seems that altruistic or other regarding, because I'm the one who's going to reap the benefit from the behavior change. Whereas I think punishment starts to feel more costly when you both have that short-term cost and you're punishing on behalf of someone else, and the benefits sort of more generally go to society through the deterrence of these types of transgressions, or the individual who was harmed that you're sort of punishing on behalf of.
First of all, hi. I'm really excited to be here. I'm sorry for the delay. I want to punish my computer and the internet. But I'm glad to be here. And Jill, I was going to say the same thing. I think that's a really relevant distinction to keep in mind, whether we're talking about second or third party punishment. But even in the case of third party punishment, and I was hoping to hear your thoughts on this, and Nikki too, of course, the reputational benefits might be muddying the water a little bit, is in terms of like third party punishment is often not purely not self-interested or altruistic as well, right? So of course we see it in these anonymous games, but then is it like a mistaken application of something that exists for other reasons? I think it gets a bit complicated in that sense.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I would kind of think about the Nichola's distinction between like the short and the long-term benefit there. Like presumably as sort of evolutionary people, we think that everything sort of in the long run that we systematically see people doing would pay off in some capacity, but it seems costly, and then like minus in the payoff matrix, and like punishment, if at least in the short term, it's costly to you. And I think of the reputation benefit as sort of a downstream thing.
So it sounds like people are kind of agreeing on this, the important distinction between, a personal kind of retaliation, punishment that one might benefit directly from, and third-party punishment. The former being perhaps easier to explain than the latter. Let's maybe go into a little more detail about this third-party punishment. What is going on with third-party punishment? Why might an individual be willing to punish those, in an interaction that they're not directly involved with? And I'll fire this out to any of you.
I can jump in on third-party punishment because I definitely think about this a lot. And I think of third-party punishment as very much about norms. And I agree with a lot of like what Joe Henrich has written on this, for instance. And we see this in children as well. They sort of they start to understand the principles, and then they really want to make sure others are following those norms or adhering to those principles. And so that feels like a certain category, whereas second-party punishment, it can be for many different reasons and be supported by many other kinds of motivations. I don't know if that's controversial or not.
I don't think that is controversial, but I think that it's not only, I think there are some cases where, for example, like in the cleaner fish, you could make the case that a male that intervenes to punish a female on behalf of a victim who's like, the male isn't the primary victim, the client is the one who's getting his mucus and scales eaten off by the female, right? So, and then the male is kind of intervening on behalf of a victim, and we actually said, okay, this is in some ways a prototypical example of what you might call third-party punishment, and clearly cleaner fish don't have norms or moral sense or anything like this, right? And there's actually, haven't published this yet, but we actually have data as well now to suggest that males will do this punishment, this sort of what you might call third-party punishment, even when they are completely uninvolved. Like it isn't a joint interaction with the female, but they simply observe a female cheating a client in the experimental setup. So I think, like, I don't disagree, but I guess I'm always like, there's always like the little devil's advocate part of me that's like, oh yeah, but what about like these species that they kind of get to this same weird destination via a different route almost.
Yeah, if I could just jump in really quickly on that. I think the cleaner fish punishment is so cool, but it's not clear to me that it's really third-party punishment, because I know you talk about the client as a victim, but it's also just the food source, right? So I don't know what cleaner fish like representational abilities are, but like, are they really thinking about the client as the victim here, or are they like, you just destroyed my access to food and I'm pissed about it? And so like, I know the study you're talking about. I was talking to Redwan about this the other day. This one where like when they're disinterested, they show it, but like this is still in the context of a stable pair where they've been feeding together for ages. So I think they still might be thinking of it not as a victim, but rather you just eliminated my food source. So
yeah, I'm talking like, it's like basically just this. Yeah, that's what I mean by like the same. I guess I'm talking about a functional outcome, and then the proximate mechanisms you use to get there are obviously like wildly different in humans and cleaner fish, right? So that's kind of the point in a way, is like you have something that functionally looks like this thing that we think is super important in humans, and yet clearly cleaner fish can't do, you know, they're not like using any of the same cognitive strategies as us to do these things. And so yeah, it's just like that. I guess that's kind of an interesting observation in a way.
I think one thing I might add is that, like, I agree that often third-party punishment is about norm enforcement, but I've sort of started thinking about it and why it exists a little more broadly in terms of just like, if you punish and it's costly to you, you're sort of paying a cost, but you have this deterrent benefit created by the punishment, meaning like whatever transgression you're punishing maybe is less likely to happen in the future. And that's useful to whoever would suffer from the transgression if it did occur. And so I've sort of started thinking about punishment in that way as just sort of another form of cooperation where you pay a cost, you create this deterrence benefit. And like most of the mechanisms that I think can explain cooperation, I think could support that. So like even without a complicated normative context, I think direct reciprocity could in principle support that. Like if you know, I have a best friend who's getting bullied and I punish the bully, and so then they stop harming my friend, like my friend could appreciate that and reciprocate in all sorts of friendship ways, and it could just be kind of thought of as a general act of cooperation. And similarly, like I could get rewarded for doing it, I could get punished if I didn't do it. I could signal that I'm the type of person who invests in cooperation, and this could boost my reputation. So I kind of think of the explanation for third-party punishment as being almost as broad as the explanation for cooperation.
I really like the way you put that, Jillian. Definitely agreeing with a lot of what's been said. Yeah, I also think of third-party punishment generally broadly. And I think that the psychology can get super, super complicated, and there can be so many reasons and routes to get you to that kind of behavior. Thinking about like reputation is obviously not just one thing, right? You could be having that reputation as someone who follows through on that promise of protection that you provided for your friend. You could be getting that reputation as a trustworthy reciprocator in that context. You could be getting a reputation for that you've demonstrated the physical capacity to do that kind of punishment, and other people need to be attentive to that. You've demonstrated the capacity, you've demonstrated the intention towards living in a community where the behavior that was punished is not tolerated. And so, and that's just 3 off the top of my head.
So I love this idea of reputational benefits for punishment. Obviously, I guess one question would be, how important would we think that sort of function of this is of these punishment is relative to some of these other functions, like just pure inequality aversion, for example, or just pure spite. You know, what are your thoughts on the relative importance of these? Go for it, Max.
Sure. I think that there's just like kind of in follow up to what Nikki was saying about we need to separate out the time course of when we're calculating the benefits and costs, because that's going to give us different lenses and different potential definitions of what we're talking about. There's so many of those like multiple lenses that you could take on this, because are we talking about outcomes? If you're focused on outcomes, a behavior can look like inequity aversion. Like I'm avoiding a situation where I end up with less. But that might not be the best way of describing the behavior, because maybe it's not about the outcomes, it's about the intentions that are revealed by a preference for those outcomes, right? So if you act in such a way that has that disparate impact on me, am I merely trying to rearrange the resource distribution between us in the present? If so, looking at like the expense that I incur in order to do that, it starts to feel irrational, altruistic. We start to use these words that are kind of like red flags for, you know, something that's going to need an explanation, right? But on the other hand, we keep talking about punishment having this long time horizon of when the benefits are going to be recouped over, right? And that's not about merely the resources in this one interaction. That's about what that says about how behavior is going to continue into the future.
So this is maybe a good time to bring in, when we're talking about these long-term things, I guess one of the questions from the audience here, David Putz has asked just a bit of an explanation as to why it's definitionally necessary for the punisher to pay a short-term cost. Like, why is this a necessary component of the definition of punishment, and if so, why?
I think that it's true. Like, some people would define punishment as saying you don't, like, it doesn't need to necessarily involve a cost for the punisher, and I think that's fine, and it's sort of pragmatic in a way, and you can, that you can define punishment like that if you want to. The main reason why I guess people are interested in cases where it does involve a short-term cost is that those are the more puzzling scenarios to explain from an evolutionary perspective, because you're immediately in a realm where individuals are paying costs, and so you then are asking, well, how is that, and how can that be reconciled with our view of evolution, which is whereby we assume that somehow these costs are paid back in some way, in time, over time. And so I think it's fine to, I think you can basically call punishment what you want, really. I mean, like, I'm not going to be the person to say, like, this has to be the definition or that has to be it. But I think the reason why people have focused on cases where it does involve a cost is because those are the kind of puzzling situations that we're interested in as evolutionary biologists.
So if I
might also
go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say, I might add to that a little bit by saying that, like, I think traditionally it's maybe been defined as both costly to the punisher and the person being punished, but I think it seems clear that the latter is sort of more essential. Like it certainly wouldn't be punishment if it weren't costly to the person being punished, but I think something that I get asked sometimes is, like, do I think it's punishment if I just, like, condemn someone on social media that I don't know? They're probably not going to retaliate against me. It doesn't take a lot of investment on my behalf. And I would typically say yes to that, because I feel like it's quite costly if a lot of people do that to the person being punished. It can have the consequence of deterring the action that you're punishing them for. And so it seems to sort of operate like punishment even without a big investment. But I think, like, at the point when it's actually beneficial to the punisher, it starts to feel like we don't need punishment as a concept to explain why you're doing it. You could just be doing it for the direct benefit in it. So that's kind of how I think about the cost aspect.
So if I transgress against you and you punish me by stealing my stuff, there's not a heck of a lot to explain there. It's pretty obvious. Maybe leaning. Oh, Max has something he wants to add to that.
I think that if we're gonna, like, draw a boundary around a behavior, we want to make sure that, like, we're not missing edge cases, or we're not missing things that don't meet that definition but look, act, and otherwise behave just like the thing that we're talking about. We have examples in the literature of expenseless punishments, things that don't cost the punisher anything, working just like expensive punishment in certain cases. There are times when you don't have to spend anything, but through the communication of your, like, application of this effect on the other person, you've gotten them to change their behavior. And we have cases where punishment can be non-cost imposing, right? You can assign punishment points, and that can enforce rates of public good contribution. Runa Masarin here in the talk, in the chat, has a recent paper on non-cost imposing punishments being actually somewhat optimal for the recalibration of behavior. And I think it kind of illustrates potentially that we're talking about maybe multiple kinds of things, that there is a division here, but it's not punishment versus non-punishment. Like, we keep bringing up a word, deterrence. And I think that evokes for a lot of us this idea that we're self-interested actors, And in order to change your behavior, I need to change your payoff matrix, right? This is kind of like the mutually assured destruction model of how I get somebody else to not nuke me, right? I need to make sure that they know that the costs are so big for them. On the other hand, in that kind of model, you actually need to have the weapons. Like, a mutually assured destruction doesn't work if I don't have the nukes, or you know that I wouldn't use the nukes on you, right? It's no longer deterring if either of those things are not true. So for that kind of deterrence thing, it matters that it's costly and that it, well, or at least that it's cost imposing, On the other hand, if we're in a long-term relationship, like if we're cleaner fish and having that partner around in the future is good for me, I have a stake in their welfare, it's probably bad for the relationship if I use like excessively costly punishment on them, if I had the choice of doing something less costly that would get them to change their behavior. And so that might reveal that there's something besides that kind of deterrence flavored punishment going on. I've been calling it to myself just recalibration, but maybe that's not the best word. I'd love to hear everybody else's thoughts about possibly if we're pulling apart two different phenomenon here when we're talking about punishment.
Can I just, oh, go ahead, Katie, sorry.
Well, I'm just glad you brought up deterrence, because it seems like, in some ways, it seems like everyone's kind of on the deterrence bandwagon, and I guess that's who we are, right? Like, generally we like it. I mean, Nikki, I know you have this paper for second party punishment where you're suggesting alternatives, right? But this again seems like a place where we need to be thinking about third party and second party punishment separately. And even if we're just talking about third party punishment, where people seem fairly happy with deterrence as an explanation, I think, or some people do anyway. There seem to be a bunch of things that we still need to reconcile from certainly the psychological literature, like why we seem so retributive, like why we punish when it can serve there's no possibility that it can change behavior, or why sometimes we are more punitive of out-group members than in-group members, even though a strong deterrence account would suggest, I mean, Jill, you and I have talked about this a ton, right? We should really be preferentially punitive towards in-group members. So yeah, I think that, and then Max, to your point, I think some of these situations where it's really low cost, but still the idea is to influence behavior, might be sort of punishment in a pedagogical context, and it's really serving a communicative function. And I see that a lot for like parents punishing their children. The idea there is not to inflict huge costs on the child, but rather to communicate a standard of behavior that they want their child to adhere to. So yeah, I would love to hear people's thoughts on like whether we all love deterrence or whether we have different thoughts on deterrence.
Does anyone want?
I think
Go ahead,
that.
Jeff.
Oh yeah. So I think I'm like pretty pro deterrence, is sort of thinking it's fundamental to punishment, both in the second party and third party space. I think these cases where communication is essential are really interesting. I was actually, Pat asked us like papers that we think are new and cool, and I was going to bring up a ruse paper because I think it's really cool. But I do think that like in these types of contexts, the threat that eventually you would ratchet up the costliness of the punishment is part of why the communication like works, and why you can do this minimalistic punishment, and then the other party feels like, oh, it's like really upsetting that this person who I have a relationship with said this biting comment to me, even with no material cost to me. Like, I should really be calibrated. Like it feels really bad to hear that. And I think that there's like a good functional reason, which is that like, you know, that if you just ignore it, then they will sort of ratchet up their punishment and will start to materially matter more. So I kind of don't think of these examples as undermining the essential role of deterrence ultimately, but just highlighting sort of how much communication can do in a relationship that's already established. And I guess I think that insofar as like punishment is targeted at a behavior, it should serve to deter. I actually think with the retributive thing, like if you know everyone has a retributive psychology, like that would deter you from transgressing initially, because like, you know, they're like ready to punish you, even if it couldn't change your behavior, like at that point. So I guess I don't see the retributive psychology as undermining the deterrent function. And I feel like I'm pretty pro deterrence and thinking about all this stuff.
What do you make of the out-group, in-group stuff then? Like, why are we so punitive of outgroup members?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I think that, like, I do sometimes wonder if it's just punishment mixed with like an outgroup bias more generally, or so like seeing the same transgression is more needing to be deterred when it comes from the outgroup, or like sort of a power hierarchy like function of just sort of you want to keep the outgroup down or something like that. But I agree that it challenges the primacy of deterrence.
I might jump in and argue that it mixes a couple of things here. One is there may be just an element of pure spite in the higher punishment towards outgroups, but the other possibility is bringing in what Max said about you have a vested interest in those whom you are interacting with in a long term, a reciprocal relationship. Members of your in-group with whom you have reciprocal relationships and you rely on to a certain extent, and perhaps that's what's dampening the punitive reaction towards others. So, normally, if some totally unrelated individual were to transgress against me, I might have a very strong reaction to deter them. Want to have a high retribution sense in order to deter this right up front. But then that willingness to impose costs may be suppressed a little bit if I have a vested interest in that recipient's welfare, the most obvious of which being my own children. I'm going to impose less harsh costs on my own children than I am about friends or in-group members. And whereas an out-group member, there may be nothing to suppress that reaction. And in fact, maybe through the spite mechanism, it might in fact accentuate it.
That's a really good point, Pat. I think that also illustrates kind of like the flip side, or not the flip side, but the other dimension of the uncertainty. So like we've been talking about there being like multiple motivations for punishment on the punisher side, such that there's like ambiguity over why they're doing it, what they're trying to achieve. There's also the ambiguity over like what the behavior was about. So like in the case where your partner hits the outgroup member, or your partner hits the in-group member, your mate cleaner fish takes the bite of the mucus, like each of these contexts has raises potentially different possibilities over what that act actually reveals about the actor's intentions towards you, and then those who you have a staked interest on their welfare. Andy Delton and I, because there's more than one Andy, have a paper showing that at least a piece of this effect seems to be about those kinds of inferences, right? So when an action is happening in an in-group context, like say Pat says something mean to Jillian, that might be because of some factor that Jillian and I have in common. That might be about a group-related phenomenon, and I'm part of the group, and therefore I have some kind of interest in that behavior not happening anymore. But they have a personal relationship. That might be something that has nothing to do with me at all. And so it's unclear whether that's something that should even arouse my punitive instincts. On the other hand, if there was some outgroup member who did that same thing to Jillian, that feels much more like, at least to me, a circumstance that was like, makes the group salient. It says that happened because Jillian was a member of this community. That's revealing how that person would act towards me, another member of this community. This is like the difference between, you can use a pejorative term, the N-word, within a racial community, but across community lines, it starts to make it seem like different inferences are at play.
So I think this is an important point with the what inferences people are making about punishment, and what then does the punitive reaction towards that convey. I think maybe what I might want to do now is just to make sure we get a chance to get some of the questions from the audience too, is maybe bring in some of those, and I'm sure that they will spur even more discussion as we discuss many of these other issues. One question that Chris von Royden asked is whether or not policing is a subset of third-party punishment, and how does it evolve? I don't know if anybody in particular wants to jump in on that one.
I think this is going to be a bit of a non-answer, but like I think under the classical definition, I don't actually. This Clutton-Brock definition is the one we've all been using for many years now, right? And I actually now think it's as empirical evidence has accumulated, it's become increasingly apparent that punishment is this multi-headed beast, and that there are many different ways that investments to harm other individuals can ultimately be favored by selection, and it's not always due to contingent behavior change on the part of the target of punishment. And so the classical example of policing in the non-human world would be, say, like in social insects, where some of the workforce will eat the eggs that are laid by their sisters, the illegal eggs that are not the queen's eggs, and by doing so, they prevent the sisters from breeding. Now, if you're going to stick with the Clutton-Brock definition of punishment, you might say, well, that isn't punishment because there's no contingency there for the sisters that are eating the eggs, that are policing their illegal sisters. That for them to derive a benefit from doing that doesn't require their sisters to change their behavior in future. So there's no contingency. What they're doing is immediately self-serving and can be explained by the benefits that are generated simply from not having those eggs in the nest, and you don't need to postulate any behavior change for that to be under positive selection. I think that classically we probably would have put policing out of the definition of punishment, but I think that now, as we have started to realize that what we're studying in humans often doesn't conform to this classical definition either, where it's like, you do something to me, I smash you, and then next time you're not going to do that thing to me. Like, that basically never happens. Like, we haven't got any empirical evidence that punishment really works like that. And so probably these examples of, like, you do something to me and I do something to you and I get a benefit a different way that doesn't rely on you changing your behavior are admissible in this kind of more umbrella, multi-headed thing that we are now actually dealing with.
I also think policing is like a nice way to bring in institutional punishment as a construct and like cultural evolution. Like in my view, if I think about how policing evolves, like I would think of policing as institutionalized punishment, where we as a society have sort of agreed, like, here are the things that are transgressions, here are the punishments that come of them, here are the designated, like, sort of people who have authority to enforce that. And it seems like this isn't like an individual behavior that evolves. It's clearly like something that, like, cultural evolution would be useful for explaining how it evolves at like a societal level. And insofar as it creates benefits for society by deterring transgressions and making people follow norms that society thinks improve welfare, like, it seems like that's something that could be imitated by other groups and could kind of evolve through cultural evolution.
I think this is a good time to bring in some of the research from Elinor Ostrom's Nobel Prize winning work on different societies around the world and how they've managed to successfully solve resource problems and prevent tragedies of the commons. And one of the more common features is that they all do have some monitoring system to detect, who is over extracting from the resource, who is cutting down more trees than they should, who is drawing more water than they should from the common wells. So they all do have this monitoring system, and they have like a graduated series of costs. So it might start with a warning, and then there's a fine, and then there's a bigger fine. And I guess one of the things to come from this is that the imposition of these costs is in fact often not costly for the community. If you're imposing a fine, well, that pays for the policeman's salary. So they have this mechanism built in of policing in order to prevent over-extraction and created it such that it is individually beneficial to do so. But I think, Jill, you've also raised an interesting question there when we talk about different cultural institutions, because this is, of course, a question that's often come up when people talk about punishment. Some of the first research on this topic was done within the context of proponents of cultural group selection. So I guess a question might be, to what extent does group selection or cultural evolution add to our understanding of punishment? Is it necessary in order to explain why punishment exists? And what does it bring to the table?
That's a great question. That's not the one I wanted to tackle just yet, because I just wanted to double click on Jill's point about how policing does bring up institutional punishment, but I also see it really early in development. Like, one of the first kind of forms of punitive behavior we see in children is tattling, which shows this like understanding that you can outsource punishment. Like, I understand that something has happened. I need someone to do something about it, but I'm not the authority here. So I'm going to like go get the relevant authority. So I do think, I mean, maybe there's some institutional thing happening there, but I also think it's just very foundational. It would be cool to know how consistent that is seen, like what the role of parents in mediating conflict in childhood would be across different societies. So someone else should take the group selection question though.
So it's not directly answering the question, but like the book has a horrible title, but there's an amazing book called The Law of Primitive Man. It's by a guy called Hobel, and it actually documents like the kind of different institutions that I think that 7 small-scale societies have converged upon to manage basically social dilemmas. And one of the striking things when you read it for me at least, I found super interesting is that quite a lot of the institutions have like really similar pillars that underpin them. Like, for example, a common theme seems to be like there are usually institutions that limit the scenarios in which punishment can occur and limit and that place restrictions on who is allowed to punish whom for doing what. So it's not just like a free-for-all and anyone can punish anyone for doing anything. Like, there are usually kind of rules about how this can be done that are there to limit this tool that we have from devolving into the feuds that we so often observe when we do these things in the lab, and where we don't put those institutions into the games, right? So I think that there is something super interesting to be uncovered there about to what extent is the way that we have institutionalized punishment, like to what extent are these kind of shared features that you see in different societies, are those things really commonalities, or are there actually more differences across societies than there are similarities among them? And I don't really know of any work that speaks to that. I think that's really an empirical question, but it speaks to your broader point of like, to what extent how do we understand the role of cultural group selection, for example, in selecting out these different punishment norms that exist in human societies.
Anybody else want to bite, or shall we go back to? I can take one of the questions from the audience that I guess maybe relates to something that Katie said. I think the example of children coming in and tattling and trying to bring in somebody else to do the punishing on their behalf is interesting. And of course, within families, there's often when one sibling is calling for this punishment, there may be some sort of a compensation. Okay, I will take the toy back from them and give it to you. And one of the questions is why in human societies there's the argument about whether or not punishment is often paired with compensation. And to what extent that this is true, and does this addition of compensation, what implications does it have for our explanations about punishment?
I'll jump in on this one because when you emailed us to think about a paper that we really liked, one of my favorite papers is from Oriel Feldman Hall on compensation versus retribution in third versus second party punishment. And as I recall, the punchline is essentially in second party situations, we prefer compensation, but in third party situations, we want to punish transgressors. And I think you're right. So even like, I'll just focus on third party punishment. Often in the real world, you get two bangs for your buck, right? Like, and you can both punish the perpetrator while restoring justice in some way to the thief. Yara Dunham and I just published a paper looking at whether children will go for retribution or compensation when they have to choose. And I really thought this was in the context of fairness norm violations. And we know children in this age range, 6 to 9, they love equality. They'll do a lot to achieve equality. So I really thought they would go for compensation, which is the option that they could invest in that would lead to equality. And in fact, that's not what we saw. So when they were forced to choose, they went for punishment over compensation. However, we know from even younger children, like 5-year-olds will pick the option that both punishes and restores justice. So I think if you can do both, of course, people are going to pick both. And I totally agree that compensation is sort of this neglected area. There's other developmental work from Young-Un and Felix Warneken suggesting that children actually prefer those who compensate rather than those who punish, even though they actually enact punishment themselves.
One thing I might add to that is like, I think that they seem linked in the sense that like, A, there are two things you do in response to wrongdoing, and B, psychologically, they both seem to sort of restore justice and make something wrong feel more right. But like functionally, I think they have pretty different functions. And like, since I'm just going to talk about deterrence constantly today, like I feel like punishment deters and compensation doesn't. Like if I steal from Katie and everyone wants to pool together and give her what I stole back, like that's great for me. I just got to keep this thing for free. So like, I don't think that I necessarily think they make sense to think of in an either or way from a functional perspective, because I think they've got pretty different purposes, and that compensation seems more about like appealing to senses of fairness, maybe insuring people against a loss and like pooling our resources when that happens. And that just seems like a totally different function to punishment. And I don't think compensation can ever deter.
Definitely want to agree with what Jillian, the direction Jillian's going with this and what she just said. I think that we have so many situations that we can have in our minds that can nudge our intuitions around about whether or not something's punishment worthy and whether or not we would expect punishment and what exactly punishment would mean in that circumstance. One thing that I think sometimes nudges people either up in their punitive sentiment in some circumstances and down in other circumstances is the possibility of others seeing your punishment as driven by ulterior motives. I think this is going along in one of Pat's results, which is that people don't like punishers. They much prefer, I mean, this is similar to Oriel's work as well, but with adults. And I think that this is also kind of like for a deterrence related reason, right? So like if I'm third party punishing, it could be because I'm trying to get that benefit. Like I could be virtue signaling. I could be trying to derive some private reputational benefit from my action. It might not be because I have some overriding concern for the community or its norms. And so we could probably imagine circumstances that would make that ulterior motive pop or be suppressed. And I'm guessing that, I mean, maybe it's just me, but like, I feel like my own outrage really gets suppressed when I feel like by demonstrating outrage, the impression I would give others is that I have ulterior motives.
I think this is maybe a good segue to one, and maybe pass this over to Jill, because you've got some I think research related to this question, and maybe also I noticed that there's some action in the chat, people asking about dishonest signaling within a punishment context. So maybe Jill, do you want to speak a little bit about those issues?
Yeah, sure. So I think that when we talk about punishment and dishonest signaling, we're often thinking about a scenario where like I punish someone for doing X thing, but like actually I also do X thing. And the dishonest signaling comes in the fact that like people infer from my punishment of X thing that I would not do X thing. Therefore they think I'm moral, trustworthy, etc. But actually I'm not. I do this transgression myself. And so it's like hypocritical punishment. And I think that this is like basically the thing we really dislike about hypocrisy is the false signaling aspect. So I've done some work trying to suggest that like if you remove the false signaling from hypocrisy, like I condemn a thing, but I do the thing. But when I condemn the thing, I say like I think it's wrong to do it, but sometimes I do it anyway. So like I avoid false signaling. Then like people don't actually think I'm worse than a non-hypocritical transgressor. So I think like a big component of our aversion to hypocrisy is this false signaling. And I think on the other hand, though, like there's sort of little enough false signaling in the world, and we could think about why, that like people still treat punishment as a meaningful signal and like do make the inference when I punish X thing that I'm less likely to do it. I'm not sure if that speaks to the question.
Do you think that dislike applies also for punishment that might be demonstrating one's personal formidability or willingness to retaliate against personal insults? Do you think people are equally averse to false signaling in that domain?
So you mean like if I second party punish and it implies that I'm like formidable and will retaliate in the future, but actually I'm not?
Yeah.
Interesting. I've never really thought about that one. I feel like the ability to fake it is like more challenging, maybe. Like it feels like I think there are reasons we don't get a lot of cases where I condemn X thing and actually in like somebody else, but actually I do X thing, but not because it's like difficult to do that. Whereas like, if I like physically aggress against someone for wronging me, it seems like pretty tightly linked to being able to do that in the future. So and then I guess I don't know that in practice there's a lot of observation of that kind of false signaling. Maybe other people disagree.
There would be in non-humans. I mean, like the classic example is this crab, I think, that has this big claw, but it molts and it lives in is it a fiddler crab? It lives in a burrow anyway, and at some point it molts and it loses its hard shell, but it keeps one claw like good, and then if anything walks past its hole, it kind of waves the big claw, so everything doesn't think to attack it, even though it is actually completely vulnerable. So I think you can have that kind of false signaling, but I don't know about studies in humans along the lines of, kind of aggressing someone, but you then don't back it up. You can't back it up.
Maybe it's more like a correlation where as long as there's a positive correlation between these two traits, the audience will pay attention to it. But of course, it doesn't need to be a correlation of 1. If it's a correlation of 0.6, it's still useful information, but there may nevertheless be cheaters and fakers in this, kind of exploiting this overall system that's honest on average, but maybe it's not 100%.
Yeah, totally. And I also think that like when the cost of punishment gets lower, the perception that false signaling is ubiquitous seems to increase. So like I think, again, this is kind of interesting with condemnation on social media where it's often not that costly, especially if you're condemning like a public figure or someone you don't have a relationship with, so that they're not going to retaliate against you. And it seems like a situation where people might perceive more false signaling. I don't know of any empirical work actually testing if the honest signaling value of condemnation is like lower in that context, but it seems believable to me, which I think is interesting.
This is maybe a great segue into online punishment in general and online shaming, which is arguably the kind of punishment that we see the most these days. I guess what are people's thoughts on online shaming? How is it a good thing? How does it differ from in-person punishment? Is it a force for good or for evil? A bit of both?
I think it sort of depends what you think. I mean, again, coming back to this idea that punishment is not this, it's this multi-headed beast in a way. And it sort of, I mean, increasingly I came around to the viewpoint, and it took me a while to kind of realize it's like, okay, this classic view of punishment is nothing like what we ever see in the empirical literature. But I think one main proximate mechanism for why people punish, and also can explain on an ultimate level, how they benefit from it is just status competition. And like, I think a lot of what you might be seeing in these kinds of pylons and where people start aggressing against someone who's done something online, it's like a relatively cheap way to have a pop at someone and potentially gain some, improve your own status or improve your status in the eyes of some relevant in-group people. That's kind of the downside benefit of it. And I think that it, like, I wouldn't necessarily say that is a force for good. I mean, it's not clear to me that this kind of behavior really encourages the target to somehow behave more cooperatively in future. If that's what we think the social good is, I don't think there's that much. I don't know if it really has that effect.
Yeah, I think that as basic scientists, we probably all are a little bit hesitant to label something as good or bad. It's kind of like, not our monkeys, not our circus. But, taking off my scientist hat and just being a person, we have so many different things that we talk about and so many different perspectives on those things when we're talking about online shaming or canceling or cancel culture or canceling cancel culture, or what, like, already there's all these angles and motives. I think a fundamental dimension that is different when you go into the online space that probably informs both the phenomenon that we see and also people's reactions and diverse reactions to the phenomena is how power changes when it becomes so cheap and easy to coordinate intentions and representations. So like when you don't have the power individually to effectively deter someone's bad action, you can't punish them, right? Or at least not punishment as deterrence. But if by virtue of having this online community, all of a sudden the power relationship switches and you're able to actually effectively punish them, that explains why you would see an increase in that kind of behavior in those circumstances. It also seems to suggest why, some people think that increase in power and a group's use of it is a good thing, and why other people would think that group's increase in power and use of it is a bad thing.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I mean, sorry, I'll be very quick, Katie. I think basically what's at stake when people ask if they think online shaming is good is like, do you think this new subset of transgressions that's getting more punishment than it did before, like, should be getting that? Like, is that proportionate? Is that appropriate? Is the stuff that's getting punished now actually worthy of punishment? And I feel like it kind of depends. I'm not going to take a general stance on that, but I think, like, insofar as you agree with that, I think then it's serving a purpose of changing the norms and deterring stuff. And the question is, do you want that stuff deterred in this way?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. You said it much more eloquently than I would have. But I think, looking at COVID norms, for instance, is a case where, like, maybe people updated more quickly on standards of behavior like mask wearing because there were all these public videos of people getting shamed at airports for not, refusing to wear a mask and things like that. So I think, like, if we given that we find ourselves in situations where the norms have to rapidly evolve and we need to figure out what to do, like, in those cases, maybe it's just a very valuable signal about what the new community standard is.
And I guess maybe knowing what we know about punishment, do you have any thoughts on how to, stop it from going too far, how to make it more effective in order to, harness the good side of it, where it's, maybe targeted towards things that, we might all agree with, like, COVID mask wearing, for example, and yet to avoid some of the nastier, more competitive side of it. What might we do in order to, optimize punishment?
Okay. I actually thought about this quite a bit with this a paper that I wrote with Red One last year, and I think, like, one of the big things with, if you look at, I think a lot of our penal systems, the design of our Western penal systems, at least, is quite massively informed by our psychological propensity and preference for retribution. And so a lot of how our Westall penal systems are designed is basically based around one bad thing deserves another, and if you do a bad thing to someone, you deserve to have a bad thing done to you, and that satisfies some kind of psychological motive apparently, and is popular when it comes to policies and things like that. But I think, like, if we agree that a major goal of punishment in society is to reduce cheating, by which I mean like criminal offences and things like this, it's our penal systems are so bad at doing that. Like, there is just basically hardly any evidence that that increasingly severe punishments act as a stronger deterrent, or that giving people harsher punishments is more likely to reform them and change their behavior in the future. And I think that one of the things we've massively missed in the design of Western penal systems, where we could learn a lot actually if we looked at if we took a more cross-cultural approach to thinking about punishment, is the importance of rehabilitation and restorative justice, and giving people who have done the wrong thing, in inverted commas, a route to re-enter back into society, rather than just focusing only on retribution. We have to think way more about rehabilitation and restorative justice. And I think someone whose work that people here might not know, I mean, they probably do, but Polly Wiesner would be somebody I would really recommend reading her papers. But that's my big sort of, not like polemic or something like that, but like, I have thought about this quite a bit, and it kind of is a bit frustrating in a way that the penal systems we have are so informed by our psychology, and that we haven't managed to find ways to design them to be more actually effective for the job at hand.
Cool. I think we're probably getting close to the end of time here. It's about 11:44. Maybe what I'll do is, if anybody has any thoughts that they want to close things out with, anybody wants to give some final thoughts. I'm assuming that's what the HBES symbol is appearing for, is kind of a kind of a wrap it up sort of symbol. Okay, or we can leave it with Nicola's a final comment being, I guess, a nice kind of wrap up way to do it. It ties in many of the issues that we've talked about the functions of it. It addresses some of the questions in the question thing about how this relates to legal systems. And so it brings a lot of that together, and offers perhaps a way forward about what alternatives there might be to straight up punishment. So I guess what I'll do then is I will just thank all of the panel members for being part of this. I had a lot of fun listening to everybody. And so I want to thank the organizers as well. So Paul, Chris, Courtney, and to Corinne Apicella and Chris Van Ruden for, I guess, kind of also organizing a lot of this as well. So thank you, everybody.
Great. Thank you so much, Pat. All right. Before we go, I want to again thank our moderator, Pat, and our speakers for that wonderful discussion, the Executive Council for their support of the series, and all of you for being here. And we do not yet have another event scheduled, but please keep your eyes out for announcements about future events in the coming weeks. And please remember to register for the HBES virtual conference, which will take place June 24th to July 2nd. And finally, we welcome feedback from HBES members to improve the event. So if you have any comments, please feel free to email them to hbesroundtableseries@gmail.com, and I shared that in the chat. So again, thank you all so much for coming, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you so much also to Pat for moderating this. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Nice to see everyone.
A lot of fun.
Yes, thanks, Pat. Good to see everyone.